stranger to us. He is an American Protestant minister and political activist. He is the president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. He also serves as a member of the national board of the NAACP and the chair of its Legislative Political Action Committee. And from 2006 to 2017, Barber served as president of the NAACP's North Carolina State chapter, the largest in the southern United States and the second largest in the country. Also, he's a pastor. He's pastored Greenleaf Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Goldsboro, North Carolina since 1993. And his Twitter handle is @Reverend Dr. Barber, @Reverend Dr. Barber. So we got to make sure, I know he's going to say something. He's going to give us some tweets tonight. And then last but certainly not least, we have Jelani Cobb. He is an American writer, author, and educator, the Ira Littman Professor of Journalism at Columbia University. Cobb was previously an associate professor of history and director of the Institute for African American Studies at the University of Connecticut from 2012 to 2016. Since 2015, he has been a staff writer at The New Yorker, and he has been a political contributor on various cable shows. So welcome, guests. And his Twitter handle is simply @Jelani Cobb.
No, @Jelani9.
Oh, Jelani, I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
@Jelani and the number 9.
Gotcha. @Jelani9. Okay, that's simple. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you and welcome. We're going to have a conversation. I'll ask you some questions, and if you want to jump in and respond, then by all means do so. We're going to start with Mary Curtis. Race and politics is nothing new that's happening, but tell me, what are you seeing that's different this go round than has been years past, or is there no different? Talk to us about that.
Well, you know, my son is a historian, Yale educated, and he always tells me that there's nothing new. When something happens, there's always, with progress, always comes pushback. And I'm sure Mr. Cobb would agree, whether it's labor or women getting the vote or civil rights activities. And I do think that, you know, the first presidential campaign I covered was 2008 with Barack Obama. And you did see some euphoria, but you did see some pushback. And I think we're seeing a lot of the pushback to the progress come up. And you see folks marching in the streets now because some of the things that folks of color have known for so many years about interactions between law enforcement and the communities they protect. I grew up in West Baltimore, a community that was both over-policed and under-protected. Now we have video. So we have video witness to what we have been saying. So these issues have sprouted up. And then you also see the whole country in the COVID pandemic just suffering so many health and economic crises. And that is fodder for upheaval. Add to that now a president who I think in part was elected because of the pushback from 8 years of an African-American president. And he is one who is going to pour salt in the wounds that have been with this country for so many years, since its founding, really. And you see a president who is eliminating anti-racist diversity symbols and workshops. You see someone who is giving comfort and defense to white vigilantes. And we have our security and intelligence organizations saying that white supremacist organizations are the major domestic terrorism problem. And you see him fomenting this at a time where people are on edge anyway. So you see a difference. I do think that people are acting out in a way that is difficult. It's hard to see in some ways. I get a lot of response for what I do, and some of it is supportive, but in some of the attacks, you see words, or I see words that are straight out of a presidential tweet. But you also see people of all, particularly a lot of young people in the streets demanding justice and accountability. And that's a great thing. Right now is a great time to be a journalist covering these issues, but it's also a time that's fraught because you see these fissures and fractures and leadership that at this moment is not doing anything to bring the country together.
Thank you. Reverend Barber, let's bring you in on the conversation. You've been in this fight for a very long time. Do you think that, after what Mary said, the pushback, do you think that there should have been more of an uproar, upsetting from the public? Do you see that?
Well, let me do one thing too. Let me correct, I'm not the chair of the legislative. I think that's probably from the Wikipedia. I was at a period of time, but my work is with the Poor People's Campaign, the Legislative Committee of NAACP, but my work is with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and I have served and am serving as an adjunct instructor professor at Union Theological Seminary, dealing with public policy and public theology. I think in this moment, we really have to do some deep diving, and I'm going to make some broad strokes here about where we are. First of all, I want to honor Cynthia Graham and the others that died that day, were killed and murdered that day in the church. And I want to use part of that as a jump off, because at that time, when they were killed, I did an interview with a white legislator from South Carolina. And in that, they was talking about taking down the flag, the Confederate flag. And I said to him, well, what we really need to do is an omnibus bill. Because the people in that church, like Cynthia, they believed in more money for public education. They believed in living wages. They believed in stopping voter suppression. In fact, some say that the pastor came late that night because he was engaged in fighting for more money in what's called the Corridor of Shame in South Carolina. And the person, the white guy, said to me, no, let's deal with this big thing first. And I said, what big thing? And he said, the coming down of the flag. That's huge. And I said, no, it's not. And he was shocked by that. He said, well, a lot of Black people are saying it's huge. I said, no. I said, first of all, if you're telling me that first of all, the way you're talking sounds like you're saying that only Black death matters. Because you weren't going to move this flag until people died. And now you want to then tell us you get to determine for us what the payment is for those deaths. And you get to decide all we get is a flag? When you've got racist voter suppression in South Carolina, you got racism in the way in which, in the lack of living wages, you got a state that has blocked health care, the Affordable Care Act, in a way that is hurting Black people. You've got resegregation in South Carolina, and you get to tell us that we lose 9 people and all we get is a flag. It said to me then that we really miss it when it comes to this issue of race. Now, here we are again in a moment, and we've had all of these on-camera killings by the police, on-camera killing, murders, lynching by knee or by gun, on camera, in the midst of COVID, in the midst of these economic downturns. And some people will say that there is a move in the country now to deal with racism. Well, I'm going to say there's a move in the country now to deal with an aspect of racism that surely is ugly, horrendous, and harsh, and mean, and deadly. But we can't leave it there. And that's one of the things that many of the younger activists understand. They, like Rosa Parks, are saying what Rosa Parks said after the death of Emmett Till. You kill Emmett Till, I'm going after your whole system of Jim Crow. In the old days, you killed 4 girls in a Birmingham church on September 15th, 17 days after the March on Washington. We're going to march on the South and call for Freedom Summer. You killed Swatter, Cheney, and Goodman, we're going to get a Civil Rights Act of '64. You killed Jimmy Lee Jackson and James Reed in Selma, we're going to get a Voting Rights Act of 1965. You killed Dr. King, you're going to give us a voting right of fair housing. There was a sense in which the death of individuals was a call to fight for what Dr. King called the who and the what that really killed them. And so in this moment, it is important for us to say the police violence and brutality is a penetrating point. It is an ugly, harsh penetrating point. But when George Floyd and others, and Breonna Taylor and others are killed, I believe, is forcing us to deal with necropolitics, the politics of death, who lives and who dies. And when you deal with that, you recognize that racism has always had a death measurement. It has always had a death measurement, which then means that if we're going to deal with the death measurement of police brutality, we've also got to deal with the other forms of racism that are as deadly. Voter suppression is deadly because it allows people to get elected, and once they get elected, they do things like block health care, and we know for every 1 million people that don't have health care, thousands of people die. Denial of living wages is deadly because a study was done at Columbia University that said that 700 people were dying a day from poverty and low wealth before COVID. We know environmental racism is deadly because when people die from drinking bad water and being being placed in more lethal situations in the environment. We know that the war economy and militarism is deadly. When our communities are militarized, or when our young people are sent off to war, particularly wars that we should have never engaged in the first place. So I think in this moment, what I want to say is that the death that we've seen on camera is calling us to a third reconstruction. It's calling us to do a deep dive penetration. And it's similar in many ways, lastly, to what we've seen in the past. People say, well, we've never seen biracial gatherings against racism. That's not true. The abolition movement was biracial. The first Reconstruction from 1865 to 1890 was biracial. The early union movement was biracial. Large parts of the civil rights movement were biracial. It was white and black and Jewish lawyers that went in and took on Plessy versus Ferguson. And we have to really examine at a deep level our history and what we are being called to in this moment, which is a full and thoroughgoing dealing with systemic racism, not just being against Black people, but being against the very idea of democracy itself, and the fact that racism always has death connected to it. And so if America is going to live into what we claim, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then we're going to have to deal with systemic racism and systemic poverty, not just at one level, but at every level, because wherever it is a full violation of our humanity, it's a full violation of our deepest moral values, and it's a full violation of our constitutional promises.
Yeah, thank you. Jelani, would you like to comment on that? He was talking about the deep dive and the African-American history and things like that. Tell us, what do we need to do in order to take that deep dive and to make sure that we come out better?
So there are a few things. One is that I want to thank Malcolm Graham for the invitation to participate in this. I did not have the opportunity to meet his sister during her life, but have truly been impacted by who she is and who she was in the wake of her absence. And I'll talk more about that at the end. Malcolm knows what I'm talking about. And I also want to say that years ago, I made a pledge that I was not going to ever follow Reverend William Barber again. He seemed to keep being put in a position where I have to offer inferior commentary to what the Reverend has to say. But if you'll bear with me for just a portion of the truths that Reverend Barber brought, I want to talk about something historically in the way that it impacts the context of this moment that we're in right now. And that is, we've taught generations of young people that the first president of the United States was George Washington. George Washington was the first president. We all know this. Kind of one of the initial facts that we gather as young people in elementary school. We don't talk about why he became president. Mm-hmm. And, part of that was in 1789, that first election, he was unanimous. He was the only person to ever win a unanimous vote in the Electoral College. And that was because of his stature as a war hero and a person who everyone could, and so on. But the more significant point is in 1792, when he was reelected. And Washington planned to retire. He said that. He said that he had no intention of serving more than one term, and that he would only come to help the new country get its footing, and then he would go off back into his retired life. And he was prevailed upon in 1792 to run for a second term in office. And the reason for that was that all sides, there emerged political parties. The first two political parties in the United States were the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists. And the animosity had escalated so quickly among these two parties that they believed that the country might be torn apart, and that Washington was the only person that they could agree upon that could hold the country together. And he agreed and ran for a second term. And at the end of that term, he gave a farewell address, which is another document that we know fairly well. If you haven't seen it, it's right there on Google, Washington's farewell address. And in that address, he talks about the fractures in the United States that could potentially tear the country apart. He says partisanship, that the country should be very mindful of partisanship, and this could become a fatal fracture. He says sectionalism, people becoming more aligned with their section of the country than with their allegiance to the entire country, could become fatal and tear the country apart. He said the country should be mindful of the disruptive influence of foreign governments, and that this could be detrimental to the growth and survival of the republic. Now, what he did not talk about, but was implicitly understood by all parties, was that the fracture that could become most dangerous was the fracture of race and the issue of labor and slavery. And throughout the 19th century, what we saw up until the verge of the Civil War was that both political parties attempted to prevent the issue of slavery from coming to the floor. They knew that this was such a polarizing thing, that it was such an explosive topic that it could rip the country apart. And we saw that, 1861 to 1865, the bloodiest war that the United States has ever fought. I always point out to my students that more people died in the Civil War than in any subsequent war, and that the United States would have to fight World War II 2.5 times in order to get to the number of deaths that it experienced during the course of the Civil War. So what was the point of walking through this entire history? I think that democracy is fragile. Even at its strongest, democracy is a fragile undertaking. And that it always has potential fault lines that can undermine its capacity. And in the United States, race and demagoguery around race have been used and manipulated in such ways to constantly maintain a position of a kind of zero-sum idea in the minds of many white people about how this country operates in its relationship to Black people. Anything that Black people get is something that they have lost. Now, this is a false narrative. Reverend Barber could talk to you about that much more extensively and more detail than I can about it. But this is a false narrative. And we've seen this perpetuating, nonetheless, to the present moment. Now, there are two things I'll say before I stop talking and let us get into this dialogue. The first is that two things happened in close succession in 2015. And that is on June 16th, 2015, a New York real estate and socialite figure, a social circle figure named Donald Trump declared his presidency, his presidential campaign for the United States. People seen him, the images of him coming down that escalator and making the statement about why he was running for president of the United States. And he said that he was doing so in part because the country was besieged by Mexican rapists. He made that point. June 17th, one day later, was the shooting that we saw in the Emmanuel Church by Dylan Roof. And in the course of this murderous spree, when he was questioned by a young man named Tawanza Sanders, who was fatally wounded, he wanted to know why he was doing this. He said, "You all are raping our women." And we heard that language of rape. And I don't be very clear that I'm not saying there's a causal relationship between these two things. There is not a causal relationship, but these two things are a product of the same zeitgeist. We saw that same language about rape being deployed as a justification for mass horror inflicted against Black people in a way that is staggeringly familiar to anyone who knows the least about our history in this country. And so what we have on the ballot and what we have as a concern right now in 2020 is the very survival of our democracy. That these issues, these concerns, and these dynamics that we have seen that have been the potential fatal flaws of this society since its outset are still with us. They have been exploited. Those fractures have been made deeper, that people have been turned against each other and falsely made to believe that the success of one group is contingent upon the difficulties and impoverishment of another group. And it need not be this way, but this is what we're dealing with. And this is the reason that this election is so crucial.
Yeah, thank you. Mary, go ahead.
If I could follow up a little bit on what Jelani was saying, because when he brought up the history, and I thought a lot of Black journalists and my experience in decades-long career, that initially you would go into a newsroom like the New York Times and you would be under suspicion. Can you cover a story? Because the zero sum that he brought up, that sort of white was the neutral view, that was a way of looking at the world. And there was a suspicion, are you Black? Are you going to be biased? And I used to say, listen, everybody brings their background, and even folks, white, privileged, bring that into it. It's just that that's not thought of as something that you have to think about when you're covering this story. And for these stories, this story of history and where we are, I think that Black journalists, well, we can't cover it from afar because our backgrounds are a part of illuminating what is going on. I also, I did a podcast on the 5th anniversary of the terrible murder at Mother Emanuel of all those beautiful people. And I said that there is no degree of separation. I was at the funeral of Clementa Pinckney, and he had a widow and 2 young daughters there. All of these deaths ripple throughout families, communities, and in the country. And I've known Malcolm for a while, and I have met Cynthia and knew how much she meant to the family and to the community, and her love of reading and sharing her gift. And she would have taught that 9th grade dropout who went into that church, and they prayed with him. And they were nicer to him than anyone had ever been in his life. But as Jelani said, he had found family in these white supremacists. And, this year, when she spoke at the Republican National Convention, it's interesting that Nikki Haley wanted to take credit for removing what she called the divisive symbol, but she wouldn't even name it as the Confederate flag. Because obviously now we have a president and a party who supported Confederate symbols and statues, and even threatened to hold back funds for military if bases were removing the names of Confederate generals. So as Jelani said, this is where we are, and the Reverend Barber, that we have these COVID deaths moving toward 200,000, health and economic effects primarily and especially hitting Black and brown communities. And you have now these distractions and all of these books coming out that reveal what we already know, the insulting point of view toward communities of color.
And Brother Russell,
this is,
okay, go ahead.
To me, a reason why being silent isn't an option. And you get to throw out all those suspicions of, can you look at the world through clear eyes? Because as Dr. Barbara and Jelani have been saying, this is what we've seen all along. We have connected those dots.
Go ahead, Dr.
And
Barbara.
Brother Russell, yeah, and I'm glad we're having this conversation because as both of them are saying, and there's something inside of what Jelani and Mary just said. And this is why you can't just make it about one man. See, I'm concerned too about progressives and liberals who say, it's just Trump, it's just Trump. See, that's the same mistake that the Republicans make when they say, well, a racist cop that does something, it's just that one cop. There's always been this attempt in this country to try to deal with racism as individual acts. That's why there's such a resistance to talk about systemic nature of racism. You know, interestingly enough, Richard Nixon had a quote some time ago where he actually said, a person can be a very good person, but be caught up in a system of racism, I'm paraphrasing, and engage in and promote that racist system, but personally and in their quote unquote heart, not be racist. Well, we've not really ever wanted to deal with those issues, but what's happening now is kind of a forcing. I was amazed in thinking about Jelani and Mary, as you all talk about history. You know, we were here 100 years ago. Woodrow Wilson was doing the same thing Trump is doing, denying a virus. He was a racist. He was tearing back laws that had been put in place to promote more fairness. He was undoing the last vestiges of the Reconstruction, the statue in Charleston that the white supremacists marched to as soon as Trump was in office. That statue, I mean, just before he came in office, that statue was raised more in homage to Woodrow Wilson than it was to the Confederacy, as were most of those statues. They were raised in homage to the continuations of structures of racism. Woodrow Wilson was lying. Hundreds of thousands of people died because of his lying. The country was driven into economic chaos, and then we ended up with the Great Depression. It was Woodrow Wilson that played Birth of a Nation in the Oval Office and said to his staff, this is the history we need to pay attention to. All that other stuff is, quote unquote, the wrong history. Dalen Roof was found where in North Carolina, in the city where the author of Birth of a Nation came from, was born. I mean, in some sense, we are seeing this constant struggle, and it's important in this moment that we grasp it. I think when we look, for instance, I'll make some broad strokes. George Floyd, I can't breathe. Why are so many people in the street? It's yes, because we saw that death on camera, but also because I can't breathe is shorthand for how so many people are feeling in this moment, black and white. And they are coming to terms with the fact that something that our grandmothers taught us: if you scratch a liar, you'll find a thief. Well, if you scratch a racist, you'll find a thief. A racism is a lie. So if the politicians, somebody like Trump and others, are racist, they'll also steal your health care, steal your living wages. They'll steal your protections that you need in the midst of COVID. What are we finding out in the midst of COVID? Some of the greatest public health officials are telling us that this virus has been furthered by both the inept response of the president and those around him, but also because every virus exploits the fissures of racism and systemic poverty. That's what viruses do. That's what pandemics do. They exploit. And so the very fact that America has left these fissures open, you know, before COVID, one of the things we have to talk about is what I call the 3 Ps real quickly. Prior to COVID, we had 140 million people living in poverty. Prior to COVID, we had 700 people dying a day from poverty. Prior to COVID, we had 87 million people uninsured or underinsured. Prior to COVID, every southern state had blocked the Affordable Care Act because they called it Obamacare and saw it as a black thing. Prior to COVID, we had 62 million people working for less than the living wage. Prior to COVID, we had 4 million families get up every day that can buy unleaded gas and couldn't buy unleaded water. Prior to COVID, we were spending $800 billion on the military. If we cut that in half, we would still have more money going down military than China, Russia, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea combined. Prior to COVID, we had this racist white nationalism and religious nationalism and evangelicalism that actually embraces the idea in many ways of racism. This was prior to COVID. And then in the midst of COVID, now we've got 30 million more people unemployed, 27 million people without health care. We have people, nearly 200,000 people dying. And I was reading just today, Bloomberg News reports that the 500 richest people in the world have increased their wealth by $871 billion in the midst of COVID. In the midst of COVID. And on the very day, August 18th, a day when 1,349 people died of COVID-19 and tens of millions were unemployed, the S&P 500 stock index hit an all-time record high with tech-focused NASDAQ 100. That's where we are. And it's forcing us to see that the same forces that engage in extreme classism also engage in extreme racism, and that fundamentally there's a place in which these two things are hitting together and exposing to a lot of people in the world and in America that if we don't deal with racism and systemic poverty, it takes us all down. Now, lastly, the power of this moment, though, is that Dr. King saw this. Dr. King said at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, most people don't pay attention to this, Jelani. They talk about I Have a Dream, which really wasn't the title of the speech. It was Normus and Never Again. But in his speech, standing on the steps of the Alabama State House, Dr. King said, listen, here's American history. Every time there's a possibility for poor and low-income white people and black people to come together and form a political power base that can change the country, the aristocracy sows division. He said that at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. He said every time there's a possibility. So what we are seeing now, as Mary is saying, with all of this ugliness, all of this pushback, and even the things we're not talking about, for instance, today is the 2,633rd day that Senate Leader McConnell has blocked fixing the Voting Rights Act. Now, he gets a pass, but in a real sense, if Trump is the criminal, McConnell is the getaway car driver, in a real sense. He gets a pass. But think about that for a moment. In a democracy where we know there's overt and covert racism, and the Voting Rights Act was described as the most important piece of legislation passed, even beyond the victories we had in war by Eisenhower. For 2,633 days, McConnell has blocked fixing that act in a democracy. And it's hardly getting any attention. Why? Because we have before COVID, we have the pain of COVID, prior to COVID, the pain of COVID, but this power that's right now, that the aristocracy is threatened by. Right now in this country, poor and low wealth people make up 25% of the electorate. And in 16 states, we just did a study called Unleashing the Power. In 16 states, if just 1% to 19% of poor and low wealth people, regardless of race, creed, color, and sexuality, would vote that didn't vote in 2016, they could make up the margins and determine who sits in the presidency and who sits in the United States Senate. Just less than 20%.
Wow.
Yeah. Brother Graham, bring you in on the conversation. I know history, and I guess it takes some strong people to run for office to try to make change. I guess you, politician, servant leader, tell us what does it take, and your response to all of this, and why we're still in the place that we're in today. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, and one of the things that Cynthia taught me is always to surround myself with people that are a lot smarter than I am. So I'm just amazed with the conversation that we're getting from Mary, Jelani, and Reverend Barber. But I want to go back to something that Reverend Barber said earlier in reference to Charleston and the Confederate flag. One of the things that Cynthia would have said, knowing her as I do, was that although she was killed and 8 others that night, that attack was really not about them, but it was about a race of people. Because it didn't matter that Reverend Pinckney was a state senator, that he was a father, that he was a senior minister. It didn't matter that my sister was a librarian and worked in Charleston County for 31 years. It didn't matter that the oldest member of the church was there. Didn't matter that a young man was just graduated from college was there. The only thing that really mattered was that they were there and that they were Black. And so anyone who was there and that was Black would have been attacked. And she would have said this was not about them, it was about a race of people being attacked that night. And I wrote a Washington Post editorial soon thereafter, Reverend Barber, and I said that taking down the Confederate flag was just not enough. That what we needed more was addressing the problem of systemic racism that existed in our country. That not as violent as going into a church and killing non-individuals, but African Americans are being killed, not in a literal sense, but in a problematic sense every day of the week through racism that exists in our healthcare system, the racism that exists in our education system, depending on where you live and your zip code, the racism that exists in our political system, where artificial barriers are being put in place that prevent African American people of color from voting. Racism that exists where a student at Johnson C. Smith University, historic Black college, has a 3.9 tons of community outreach credentials, but can't get a job. And the same student at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, with a 2.5 gets jobs, interviews, and a base signing bonus. That the racism that exists in our country is systemic in systems, and that we have to fix broken systems that kill literally African Americans every day of the week. And that's why voting and participating in this election is so very, very important. Nikki Haley said when she released her book about a year ago, that she said if it wasn't for Dylan Roof and Nikki Haley again went to all the funerals. She attended my sister's funeral, and she takes credit for bringing down the flag. But we know it's our sister here in Charlotte that literally went up that pole and took the flag down, right? But in her book tour, she said, but for Dylan Roof, the flag would still be flying high today. That he dishonored the flag, so they had to take it down. And so there's no personal conviction there. It's just, as Reverend Barber said, it was something to do at the time to appease feelings of inadequacy within white folks in the Charleston community. But so we can't get distracted by the flag. We can't get distracted by, and we should acknowledge the police shootings. We should acknowledge the pain that family members are feeling. The young man father that was shot recently in the back. His father lives here in Charlotte, North Carolina. He lives in my city council district. I know his pain, but we need to look at this racism with a broader sense, not just police shooting, but every day of the week through systems. African-American individuals and people of color are being left behind. And if we do not vote, if we allow the North Carolina General Assembly, for an example, to get control for another 10 years by drawing census lines in North Carolina, if we allow 4 more years of the most open and racist president in my lifetime, I've never seen anything like this. If we do not vote and fight for health care, if we don't vote and fight for our democracy, shame on us. If we would vote our numbers, if we would understand our history, if we would embrace our history, I think we can change this country in a dramatic type of way. Not just at the national level. That's where the sexing is, right? That's sexy, right?
That's right.
The presidential election. But the work gets done in the states. It's done by the General Assemblies. It's done at the local level. So we would have to, as a community, not only focus on making sure we got the right individual in the White House, but we need to make sure we got the right individuals in the State House. And so it's all of that history that was talking about earlier coming to a boiling point on November 3rd, and we got to reach out to our community and talk to our brothers and our sisters and our aunts and our uncles and our baby cousins and say, everybody go to the polls and vote our numbers, because if we do not vote our numbers, whether it's November 4th or November 25th before Thanksgiving, when we find out who our new president is and who's controlling these state houses, those decisions will impact our country for the next 10, 20 years.
And yes.
I've got to step off in a couple of minutes because I have this is happening around the country, and my Charmaine had let Brother Malcolm know. And I wanted to just take 1 minute and just run a litany for all the people that are listening, because Brother Malcolm just said something terribly important. For a moment, I want you to forget personality. And I want you to look at the policies they stand on. And I want you to realize that really on this ballot, this election is about whether we even have a chance at a third Reconstruction. On the ballot in North Carolina, just take North Carolina, 500,000 people have been denied health care by who's elected in the General Assembly. 500,000 people have been denied. 140-some thousand of them are Black, 300-some thousand of them are white. 80% of North Carolinians want a raise, want a living wage. This General Assembly has blocked even a vote on that. The person that was the architect of the law that the federal courts call surgical racism, Tom Tillis, is now trying to get elected again as senator. We get to say whether or not we like what he did, and he has voted against living wages. And ecological devastation is on the ballot this time. There are over 48% of North Carolinians are poor and low wealth. Over 50% of our children are poor and low wealth. 2.3 million Black people, 2.4 million white people in this state are poor and low wealth. There are over 1 million people, in addition to the 500,000 people that could be covered by the Affordable Care Act, there are 500,000 more that are uninsured. This election is about whether or not we're going to have a serious conversation and a serious debate and serious laws about health care in this country. And every one of the things I just mentioned, and I'm glad Malcolm said it again, is really a conversation about death. It's not just police brutality. People die when they don't have health care. People die when they're made to languish in poverty. People die. And so this really is about voting because your life depends on it, because it really does. It really does. And we have somebody in the White House that today, and I'm close to cussing, and I'm a preacher, but I'm close to, I know all 5 cuss words in the Bible, and I know how to use them, and I'm close to letting loose on all 5 of them. But this man said, not somebody else saying it, he said that on February 7th, he knew this virus was airborne. He knew that it could kill not 1%, but upwards of 5%, which also meant he knew that that 5% would be higher among us. He knew all of that. He said he meant to downplay it, and he went public, and he lied. And I think, Jelani, that study at Columbia said something like 50, 60% of the people that died didn't even have to die. Dr. King said something, and I repeat tonight. I don't claim to be totally equal to say this, but I think it was in 66, it was after the 63, Dr. King said, when you don't pay people a living wage, it is a form of murder. Mm. We have seen murderous public policy. And it's not just Trump, but it's people who have been elected to office, and they've chosen to use that power more to fill the pockets of those who are wealthy and greedy than to save the lives of the people. And it is policy murder. And it's just as deadly as a policeman shooting somebody or putting their knee on it. The difference is you don't get to see it on video, but people still are dead. This is about voting for life, y'all. It really is.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. Thank you so much. Thank you. Mary, you've been out in the public. You've talked to voters on both sides, I'm sure. Voters would say that, hey, everything is going okay here, everything is going right, and then you have other voters who say that things are not going so good. So tell us, what are you hearing out there with the voters as it relates? Because we have the history, the numbers show one thing, but people still vote another way. So tell me, what are voters telling you about how they see this election and why they vote Democrat or why they will vote Republican?
Well, I haven't been out on the trail as much as usual because of COVID. So
Mm-hmm.
I usually like to get right in the scrum. I did go to when Trump had a rally in March here, which is the beginning. I think that was his last huge one, where people were starting to hear about COVID, but most of the people at the rally were talking about it as a hoax. And it's surprising how so much is baked in. I mean, right now you have audio of Trump saying things like the Reverend Barber just talked about misleading the public about what he thought and what the scientists were saying about COVID. I really don't expect that the polls will change that much. You just have a hard 40% of folks. And when you talk with them, I mean, it's so interesting that Jelani, Malcolm, the Reverend Barber talked about systems. And I remember that wonderful piece that Malcolm wrote about his sister in the Post and talking about, that she wasn't just this name, the things that she believed in about healthcare, about literacy, about fairness, about housing. And that, I think, is the difference. For the people who will say, Trump is not a racist because, and they'll mention criminal justice reform or something. And that whole sense that people say of in someone's heart. Well, as everyone on the panel has said, it's all about policy. And for people who feel that one-to-one interaction, they also look, as Jelani said, it's a zero sum. My 401k is doing well. My stock portfolio is doing well. Why can't people pull themselves up? And on the other side, you do have people who see systems and make that connection, and they do know that something has to be done. Everything comes from that. I mean, when I talk to people who are supposed to be well-educated people, and I say, you know why my neighborhood is predominantly white? Because I couldn't have lived here, because there were restricted covenants in the deeds until 1968. They're still in the deeds. You can't rent or sell to anyone not of the Caucasian race. And then even after it was legal, people didn't move because they were intimidated or met with violence. That's just the way it was. And because of that, you can see that the supermarkets are around here, where in other neighborhoods you have food deserts. The roads are beautiful. In other neighborhoods, you might have kids waiting for the school bus in the street. You know that, Dedrick, you cover education. Housing, the whole, Trump's talking about the fear of people moving in. A housing policy, health, what is the health care? What schools are available that you can go to? We live where the systems are discriminatory. And when you talk to the voters and the people, I think that is the mindset of people who see there should be a change because there are systemic problems that we need to work on, and other people who, like Trump apparently in his interviews with Bob Woodward, who brought up systemic racism, say, I don't really believe in any of that. I'm fine. I don't really expect the polls to change. I think that people are really hardened. Trump said when he first ran, if I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and my supporters would be behind me. That was more close to the truth than a lot of people probably would have thought. And as we were talking a little bit before we opened up the discussion, I do feel that there's a lot of tension, fear, and of those things in the air. And I don't mean to be alarmist, but there are folks who feel that if he isn't elected, that something was rigged or wrong. He said that. And other folks who feel that if he is elected, that dooms democracy. And I don't hear many people who are undecided. That's where we are as a country right now. And I do feel that a lot of people feel that the opponents aren't just people who have a different worldview, but they're people who are bad people or immoral people. And I also hear a lot of alarming belief in conspiracy theories, which is also troubling. The whole deep state, QAnon language, Second Amendment solutions, these kinds of things. I think that is something that everybody should be cognizant of.
Thank you. Brother Cobb, Professor, tell us, I guess in your dealings with students, are they excited about this election? Are they engaged, or do they see what's going on? I guess what's happening on the college campuses, I guess, pre-COVID? What were they saying?
I have to say, you say you see college students. I see them on my screen. But I have not physically seen very many of them in about 6 months. But I do think there's a lot of energy around young people. And one of the things that we've seen happen is that the electorate is being curated in ways that make it difficult for young people to vote. We've seen this in Wisconsin. We've seen it in North Carolina. We've seen it around the country in various places where the issues that Reverend Barber was talking about with voter suppression have emerged and reemerged. And so I think that has had an opposite effect in many ways, that some of the young people I talk to are incensed. They're eager to get out. They understand what's at stake. They're looking at the way that COVID has impacted their ability to get an education, their ability to get a job after they complete that education, and the various policies that this administration has upheld, which have had a deleterious effect on their future prospects. And so I see and hear a lot of engagement and excitement about getting out to register their voices and make their intentions known.
Good stuff, good stuff. Councilman Graham, I know it's going to take politicians and leaders to try to make some change. And I know you participated in the Black Male Leaders March a couple of months ago, vowing change. So tell me, what is the strategy? Can politicians come together to back, other politicians who you think will make change? Because a lot of voters are just not educated and just don't know if this politician means me well. So what can you do as a city councilman to make sure that message gets out, to make sure that voters vote for the right people who will make change?
Well, there's an old saying that if the people will lead, the leaders will follow. And so we have to be very intentional in terms of listening to the constituents, in terms of what they're asking their city council, their state house to do. Here on the ground, obviously, Charlotte has had its own history dealing with police-related shootings. We've had our own history in terms of economic racism. I mean, for an example, today we had a press conference on Beatties Ford Road, which is a historically underutilized corridor, rich in history in the African-American community. We were really working hard to get a African-American developer $1 million, which is little or nothing for the city of Charlotte. Conversely, the owner of the Carolina Panthers, who just bought an MLS team, we're going to give him millions of dollars for his team and a redevelopment project. The point I'm trying to make is that it was not a tough sell to give the billionaire the dollars he needed, but fighting to give this African-American developer $1 million to invest in a historically underutilized corridor in the heart of the African-American community took a lot of work. And so the point I'm trying to make is that we have to match our policy with what people are asking for. They want police reform. I think we ought to do that. I'm not really with defund the police. I'm not sure what that means. If it means that we take a look at our police department's budget to look for efficiencies in it, where some of those dollars can be redirected elsewhere, I get it. I'm all for that. We need to look at our economic development dollars as a community and where we're going to invest it in. Clearly understand the economic return on the investment for the soccer team, but the greater impact of investing in historically underutilized corridors are really important as well. That's where people live, that's where they work, that's where they want to play. It is hard to find a sit-down restaurant, as you know, Dedrick, on Beatties Ford Road, where people can have a meal. It's a food desert. So we need to have the same type of confidence to give the billionaire the investment so he can spread that around the entire community, as we do working with a local developer who wants to impact an African American community. Johnson C. Smith University, we have to be very intentional about that historically Black college in Charlotte, giving them the resources that they need through the public and the private sector so they can be effective and efficient in carrying out their mission. I mean, so we got to do more than take down statues. We got to do more than sign proclamations about righting wrongs. We have to be very intentional about putting out dollars, setting corporate policies, working with our Citizens Review Board to give them subpoena powers. We got to listen to the public, be responsible in our response, and provide good public policy that advances how our community moves forward. So I think if you're talking about our electorate and those who are voting in the upcoming election, you have to ask elected officials, present company included, very specific question in reference to what's the return on my vote, right? What's the return on my vote in terms of economic development, crime and public safety, investing in historically underutilized communities, putting good policies in place that impact our communities. And so there has to be a return on the vote. So again, if the people will lead, the leaders will follow. We got to do marches. I've been out there marching, as you indicated, but we got to march our way to the polls November 3rd. We have to march our way to the post office and putting those census forms in the box. We have to march our way to employment opportunities and be gainfully employed in doing those things that uplift our community.
Yeah, good. And if you have questions out there, please put them in the chat. Mary, what Councilman Graham was saying, that if people lead, the politicians will follow. The people that you have done stories with, do they get that? Do they believe that? Do they see that? I mean, because I know you have reported about a whole lot of stuff about, you know, community demanding change and things like that. Can you talk to me about that? And I guess if the voters really knew the power that they had, do you think that we would have more people at the polls and, you know, we wouldn't have disappointing numbers?
Well, you do see that. As Jelani said, there's a lot of energy, particularly among a lot of young folks who going in the street day after day, and you see, as Malcolm said, demanding change on things like police reform. And people will say, well, have you been doing these protests too much? And they were like saying, well, if people would listen, and if the police our communities would listen, we would not have to be out there. And I think it's very brave, as you mentioned, I think Malcolm mentioned Bree Newsom Bass, who's, you know, went up, she's based in Charlotte. You have Councilman Braxton Winston, who's a city councilman who's also been arrested at these protests. You have so many people like working locally, Mr. Dawkins working on Safe Charlotte. And you do see a lot of activism coming from the community and making demands on the people who are our leaders. I think that is true. You're seeing, look at what happened in Rochester, where the police chief resigned or retired or something like that, because just getting up there and saying we're working on it is just not enough. And so I do think there is that energy. But as the Reverend Barbara and others have brought up, people say, what do you think is going to happen? And I said, well, voter suppression is a huge problem. And you have seen the voter purges. You see Stacey Abrams doing so much with the fair fight and trying to get the vote. But there are court cases going on all over the country of people who are fighting against some of these voting restrictions. You also see the Republican Party putting in millions to have poll watchers to go, which sounds an awful lot like voter intimidation. And the court has said you couldn't do it, but now the court has said you can. They let that lapse. So people can come and challenge you and say at the voting place. And so people really need to not just get out, as Malcolm said, be educated, have that phone number you can call if you see something or someone confronts you. It's as though you have to work for democracy. You have to get there. And you do see that energy out there, and that's a good thing. But it is daunting and a little bit demoralizing in a sense to realize in 2020 that not everyone is committed to everyone being able to vote. If you can't convince people of the value of your ideas, voters, then I guess the alternative is just making sure the people you want to vote, vote, and the people you don't want to vote, don't vote. That's a very cynical view, but it's where yeah, it's the truth. It's the truth. But yeah, I do see the energy and particularly among the young people. So that is a good thing. But I would tell people to really make sure they're on top of this voting thing, because the post office, look what's going on. We saw Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz in Florida going to inspect some postal stations and being turned back by security. This is quite serious. And so you're going to need that energy.
Yeah, exactly. And Brother Cobb, tell us, what do we need to do to move forward to make sure that, that we're not in the same place, 10 years from now? What do we need to do?
I mean, I think that we've had a lot of it outlined. We've seen a lot of people who are getting out in the street, making demands, pushing for causes that they believe in, holding the leadership that is elected accountable, registering their voters, fighting against the practices that make it difficult for people to have access to the ballot once they are registered. The whole array of things. It's going to take a lot of things that happen in the streets. It's going to take a lot of things that happen in the political halls and in the offices in Congress and in the local legislatures and so on. We have to move in a lot of different directions simultaneously. And I think that if nothing else, we understand what's at stake. And I'll say this, and we have just a few minutes left. I said at the outset that I've been impacted by Cynthia Graham Hurd even after she passed, that she'd had an impact on my life. And I spoke with Brother Graham not long after the conclusion of Dylann Roof's trial, some years back. And I'd been there for 2 weeks or however long the trial ran. And he said to the group of people he was talking to that it was his pledge, that his oath was that he was going to spend the rest of his life making sure people understood who his sister was and what she stood for. And he said that evening. The next morning, I had to be in California. And I left Charleston. I got to the airport, flew to LaGuardia in New York, went from LaGuardia to Kennedy, got a flight from there to San Francisco. And I spent the whole day traveling. And so started out on the eastern coast of the United States and ended my hotel, which was about a mile from the Pacific Ocean. And just to make conversation with the bellman who was at the hotel as I was checking in, I said, are you from San Francisco? And he said, I live here now, but originally I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. And I said, that's strange, that's where I'm coming from. And he said, what brought you to Charleston, South Carolina? I said, I was there covering the trial of Dylann Roof. And the man got a pained look on his, a pained expression on his face. And he said, that man took someone who was very important to me. And I said, who? He said, my childhood librarian, Cynthia Graham Hurd. And I felt like I could have been knocked down when he said those words. I called Malcolm and said, I went as far as I could go to the other side of this country. And the first person I had any sustained conversation with told me that he was impacted by your sister's life. And I thought he'd be shocked. And he said, I'm not surprised. He said, I'm not surprised. And so when he called and said, would you like to be part of this conversation? I said, absolutely. I understand when there are forces at work much bigger than I am, and that I have to contribute to this cause in any way that I can. And so I think that I want to commend Malcolm for the work that he's doing. I want to commend everyone who's participated in this conversation. And I think that if we don't understand what's at stake and if we don't act accordingly, history will look poorly upon us.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I guess our time is wrapping up. I'm just going to go around and the panelists and give some closing remarks. What do you want people to leave with from this conversation? And any words you'd like to say. I'll start with you, Mary.
Well, I'm just continuing on what Jelani said. I want people to remember Cynthia Graham Hurd, and I've had conversations with Malcolm about her and about his wish for people to know who she was. And I've seen the beautiful visuals and a little film that he made of the wonderful pictures of her graduating from college and being such a wonderful big sister. And I really want people to realize when you see these names, these people who are killed, who have suffered, that it's not this person, it's a family, it's community. We all feel this. There is no degree of separation. And there was a library named after Cynthia Graham Hurd, and all the libraries closed that day. And I've had so many conversations with Malcolm about her, she was a math major, but she loved reading and she got another degree and she worked at the College of Charleston. And he said, you don't need all these jobs, but she said, I love that. I love being around people and teaching them and working with them and being the librarian. And that's who we are. And we have to honor her life and by fighting for justice and fighting for the things that she believed in and realizing that we are all a part of this. And when you feel, as I say sometimes, that there is that pushback, there are people throughout history who have pushed through. And they've done that with their belief, with their activism, with their work, as Malcolm is continuing with his work as a public official, as someone who has this wonderful foundation, and as just a warm and giving member of the community. And that is something to be inspired by and also to celebrate. And just as that bellman had that memory of someone who had changed his life, realize that we can all, whatever we do or in whatever profession we are, can do something and can have an effect and can change lives and change history and change the world.
Voting is important. Professor Cobb.
I just want to reiterate again the importance of the work we're doing and being humbled by the fact that we have the opportunity to do this work, that future generations might be able to look at us and make a real serious connection between the conflict that we saw ourselves confronting and the possibility and the actions that we took to ensure that our children had a better life than we have inherited. And so I think that when we talk about the people who we respect, people who we honor, the people who we lionize, those people we talk about in February in our Black History Month conversations, we always honor those people for what they did in times of adversity. There's not a single one of those individuals that we talk about for the things they did in comfort and ease. It was Ida B. Wells out writing about lynchings in the face of the lynchers, people burning her printing press and her having to flee Nashville and only to go to New York and continue writing about the lynchers. It was W.E.B. Du Bois daring to stand up to the forces of white supremacy, and with his pen and pad and using footnotes as a weapon that he would use to defend the humanity of Black people. Whether it was Dr. King giving that speech saying that he knew that they were going to kill him sooner or later, but he was going to fight until they did. all of these people operated in times of great stress, anxiety, and difficulty. And if we really believe that we respect them and want to honor them, then we don't simply talk about them, we pick up the mantle and do what they did under similar circumstances.
Thank you. Before we go, we did have one question. This person writes, they have heard the idea in evangelical circles that President Trump may be the president for the next 8 years. Understandably, a president typically cannot run more than 2 terms. And they write, is this possible? And if so, what would this mean for the country? Anybody would like to tackle that?
That's constitutionally prohibited. So, against the Constitution. We are still nominally following the Constitution. He's giving the lip service to having paid attention to the Constitution, so it would be difficult for that to happen, under the present Constitution that we operate under.
Yeah. Also, from the latest poll in the Military Times, that the military is not favoring him, and this was before his comments. If he likes to say I have the military, but not so much.
Well, I just, Derek.
I just wanted to get that question out. That was a question that was sent, so I wanted to make sure that we did honor that.
Well, I just want to close out by thanking Reverend Dr. Barber, Jelani, Mary, for all the kind words. Cynthia is never far away. She's right over my shoulder there in the picture behind me, for your friendship and your support. I called all 3 of them and they said yes right away. Matter of fact, I didn't even call a text, which is really informal. But they all agreed to do it right away. This is a portion of the 2nd annual Charlotte Amateur Tennis Championship. We're having a tennis tournament this weekend that benefits the Cynthia Hurd Foundation. We started it last year with the town hall meeting. We thought we would do it again this year in this COVID-19 environment. So I thank everyone for joining us virtually. The tournament itself kicks off Friday. We have over 152 registered players playing. These are the best amateurs in the city of Charlotte vying for the championship. So we want to thank our sponsors, Atrium Health, Lois England. I think Lois is on the web with us tonight. Rogers Builders, the Foundations for the Carolinas, AT&T, who are our primary sponsors for the tournament. Dedrick and WBTV for being our media sponsor again this year. And so Cynthia would want us to work hard. And so tonight we did the work, and she would want us to play as well. And so this coming weekend, we will play some tennis and have some fun and try to raise some more resources for the foundation. And so I just encourage everyone to visit the foundation's website to learn more about who we are and what we do, and which is www.cghfoundation.org. And you get to learn about the programs and the services that we provide, as well as a nice video that kind of introduce you to Cynthia so you can know her in a more personal way. Again, we look forward to coming back next year. Last year was our first time doing the town hall. We had the president of Moms Demands Action with us, and we did it at Johnson C. Smith University. So we want to continue this tradition next year when we do the tournament by doing a little bit of work on the front side of it, and then having a great time socializing and raising the money for the work of the foundation. So again, on behalf of the foundation, Mary, Jelani, Dedrick, I'd like to thank Rhonda and the main event for working with me and putting this together. Like we say at the foundation, keep the faith and do the work.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. And remember, and plan your vote. Plan the way you're going to vote.
Yes, right? Vote, please. November 3rd.
Yes. Okay. Thank y'all so much. Oh, right. Exactly. All right.
Thanks,
y'all have a great evening.
Everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Great job, Dedrick.